Naomi's hands trembled as she refilled the wine glasses circling the lacquered table in Kim Jae-hyun's penthouse. The midnight view of the Han River stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul's lights reflected like scattered diamonds on black water. She shouldn't look. She never looked. In the 8 months she'd worked private events in Gangnam, she'd perfected the art of being invisible, pouring drinks around dangerous men, clearing plates near whisper negotiations, existing in the spaces between violence and respectability. But tonight, one particular document caught her eye. It wasn't the elaborate Korean-Japanese bilingual formatting or the impressive corporate seals that made her breath catch. It was the language in Article 7, Section 3, words that sent ice through her veins because she recognized them. Words that had destroyed her career once before. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She should move away. She should finish her service and disappear back to the kitchen where black servers belonged in this world of Korean power brokers. But her eyes, trained by years she'd tried to forget, traced the clause again. And again. The arbitration provision was beautiful in its lethality. Automatic transfer of assets upon temporary incapacitation. A lawsuit trigger buried in subsection D that would activate the moment the ink dried. She'd seen this exact structure before, in the contract Park and Associates had used to frame her, to strip her license, to erase everything she'd built.
아니야. She whispered to herself in Korean. No.
This can't be right. She reached for the document, her server's uniform suddenly feeling like a costume she shouldn't be wearing. Her fingers were an inch from the paper when she realized what she was about to do. Stop a Mafia boss from signing a contract in front of his Japanese partners, while dressed as the help. Kim Jae-hyun's pen was already moving toward the signature line. Naomi's hand shot out, her brown fingers wrapping around his wrist before her brain could override the instinct. The room went silent. The Japanese men across the table froze mid-sip. Jae-hyun's had turned slowly, his eyes, the kind that had seen men die without flinching, landing on her with the focused attention of a predator noticing unusual prey.
뭐 하는 거야? He asked, his voice soft as silver steel.
What are you doing? Every person in the room was staring now. A server had touched the boss. A foreigner had interrupted business. A woman had broken every unspoken rule of this world. Naomi felt the weight of cultural transgression pressing down on her, but the lawyer in her, the part she'd tried to bury under 8 months of invisibility, couldn't stay silent.
그 서명은 she said in Korean so fluent it made Jeon's eyes narrow. 사망 선고입니다.
That signature is your death warrant. The words hung in the air like a thrown knife. Someone reached inside their jacket security, she realized distantly, going for a weapon. But Jae-hyun raised his free hand, the gesture so minimal it barely qualified as movement, yet it froze everyone in place. Explain, he said, switching to English, his gaze never leaving her face. Slowly. Naomi's training warred with her terror. She was a former attorney who'd specialized in international contract law. She'd spotted a trap that would destroy him. But she was also a black woman in a country where she'd learned to make herself small, holding the wrist of Korea's most dangerous man while his partners watched and his security calculated how quietly they could make her disappear. Sir, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Article 7, Section 3, Subsection D. It's not what it appears to be. If you want to discover how a disbarred lawyer hiding as a server saved a Korean crime boss, and what he did when he learned she was more dangerous than anyone in the room, subscribe and drop a comment telling us, would you risk everything to save a stranger, or stay silent to save yourself? Your answer might surprise you. The man to Jae-hyun's left moved first, his hand sliding toward his jacket with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd drawn weapons in tighter spaces than this. But Jae-hyun's free hand lifted, barely more than a finger raised, and the movement stopped. Everyone stopped. Even the air in the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the boss to decide if Naomi would walk out of this penthouse or be carried out. Chun, Jae-hyun said, his voice carrying the same dangerous calm as still water over deep currents. Slowly, he gestured to the chair beside him with his pen, the same pen she'd stopped from signing his death sentence.
앉아. Seat.
Naomi's legs nearly buckled. A server didn't sit at the table. A subordinate didn't sit unbidden. But disobeying Kim Jae-hyun would be worse than breaking protocol, so she lowered herself into the leather chair, hyper-aware of how her polyester uniform looked next to their custom suits, how her server's vest marked her as help pretending to be human. Across the table, the Japanese delegation exchanged glances. The older one, silver-haired, expensive watch, leaned forward slightly. Kim Chujin-nim, he said in Korean thick with a Tokyo accent, if your staff is interrupting business, perhaps we should reschedule. The smile didn't reach his eyes. When you have better control of your household. It was an insult wrapped in politeness. Naomi felt it like a slap, but Jae-hyun's expression never changed. He simply turned the contract around, sliding it toward her across the polished wood.
설명해봐.
Explain it. Naomi's hands were steadier now that she had permission to use her brain instead of suppressing it. She pulled the contract closer, flipping to Article 7. This arbitration clause, she said in English, then repeated in Korean for courtesy, looks standard. It promises neutral third-party resolution if disputes arise. But subsection D includes an automatic asset freeze provision that triggers upon filing, not upon judgment. And the filing threshold is intentionally vague. Any material dispute regarding contract performance. The Japanese delegation's lawyer, younger, sharp-eyed, interrupted. That's standard protective language. Prevents either party from hiding assets during litigation. It would be, Naomi agreed, meeting his eyes, if the arbitration venue weren't specified as the Singapore International Arbitration Center, and if the governing law weren't specified as Singapore law, which has a unique provision about temporary incapacitation, triggering automatic receivership. The moment this lawsuit is filed, which can be done over any dispute, however minor, Mr. Kim's assets are frozen. The receiver appointed by the Singapore court would have full control. And, according to Section 9, Subsection B. She flipped pages with the ease of someone who'd spent years doing exactly this. The receiver must be approved by all parties to the contract. She looked up at Jae-hyun. Which means your partners choose who controls your assets. While you're temporarily incapacitated by a lawsuit they can file whenever they want, over anything they define as a material dispute. You'd lose everything without a single court judgment. Just by signing. The room was silent except for the hum of the city 40 floors below. The silver-haired Japanese man's pleasant expression had frozen into something harder. His lawyer was staring at the contract like it had personally betrayed him, or like he was recalculating how much of the trap Naomi had just exposed. Jae-hyun read the sections she'd indicated, his dark eyes moving across the Korean and English text with the focus of someone who'd survived his world by trusting no one. When he looked up, it wasn't at his partners. It was at Naomi. How, he asked quietly, does a server know Singapore arbitration law? And there it was. The question that could end with her employment or her life, depending on how honest she decided to be. Before Naomi could answer, Jae-hyun turned to the Japanese delegation with the kind of smile that didn't promise anything good. Gentlemen, I think we need to postpone this signing. My legal team requires more time to review the terms. His Korean was polite, his tone absolute. I'll have my driver take you back to your hotel. The silver-haired man's jaw tightened, but he was too practiced to show real anger. Of course. We understand the need for thoroughness. Though I should mention, our timeline is quite firm. This offer expires in 72 hours. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. I hope your legal team works quickly. The emphasis on legal team, while glancing at Naomi in her server's uniform, was meant to sting.
It did.
But she kept her face neutral as the Japanese men filed out, their lawyer casting one last look at the contract like a poker player trying to figure out which card had been exposed. When the door closed, only 3 people remained: Jae-hyun, Naomi, and a man who'd been standing so still by the window she'd almost forgotten he was there. Mid-40s, scarred knuckles, eyes that tracked movement like a predator. Jae-hyun's second-in-command, she realized. Min-suk stays, Jae-hyun said, reading her glance. He's the only person in this building I trust completely, which means you're about to become either the second person or a problem we solve quietly. Your choice depends on the next 10 minutes. He tapped the contract. Start from the beginning. Every clause. Every trap. And when you're done, you'll tell me how you know what you know. Naomi's mouth was dry, but her mind was already shifting gears, from survival mode to the analytical framework she'd thought she'd never use again. The contract appears to establish a joint venture for shipping and logistics operations between your organization and the Yamamoto Gumi. Profit sharing, territorial agreements, dispute resolution. Standard structure for this kind of partnership. But it's not a partnership. It's a hostile takeover disguised as one. She pulled the contract closer, spreading pages across the table. Article 3 establishes the profit split, 60-40 in your favor, which looks generous. But Article 12 redefines profit to exclude 17 different categories of revenue, all of which happen to be your primary income streams. After exclusions, you'd be lucky to see 15% of actual earnings. Min-suk moved closer, his skepticism evident. Naomi continued, flipping pages. Article 7 is where it gets elegant. The arbitration clause I mentioned triggers an asset freeze, but it's worse than I initially said. Section 9 specifies that during any incapacitation period, which includes the duration of litigation, a court-appointed receiver manages all operations. Section 11 defines the receiver's powers as absolute and unreviewable. And Section 14, buried in insurance provisions, requires you to maintain specific coverage that your partners control the claims process for. She looked up at Jae-hyun. They can file a lawsuit over anything: a missed meeting, a disputed shipment, a claimed breach that's entirely fabricated. Your assets freeze immediately. They appoint the receiver, who has absolute control. And if anything happens to you during that time, an accident, an illness, anything that incapacitates you even temporarily, the insurance clause in Section 14 triggers an automatic buyout at a valuation they determine. You'd lose everything. Your legitimate businesses, your territory, your entire organization. And it would all be legal. The silence stretched long enough for Naomi to hear her own heartbeat. Jae-hyun studied her face like he was reading a language only he understood. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. I employ 3 lawyers with degrees from Seoul National University, he said quietly. They reviewed this contract for 2 weeks. None of them caught what you found in 5 minutes. His eyes were hard, calculating. So, I'll ask you again, and this time, I want the truth. Who are you really? Naomi took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. My name is Naomi Washington. I was a corporate attorney at Park & Associates until they destroyed my career. And that contract. She pointed at the papers between them. I recognize it because they used the same structure to frame me. The memory came back sharp as broken glass. 18 months ago, Naomi had sat in a conference room 3 floors above Gangnam Station, surrounded by the kind of luxury that announced Park & Associates as Seoul's most prestigious international law firm. Senior partner Young had personally recruited her from New York, praising her expertise in cross-border M&A, her fluency in Korean, her Harvard credentials. We need someone who can bridge cultures, he'd said. Someone exceptional. She'd believed him. God, she'd been so hungry to believe him. The Hanmi Industries deal had been her showcase, a $300 million acquisition that required navigating Korean corporate law, American securities regulations, and the delicate politics of a family-owned chaebol going public. She'd worked 16-hour days for 3 months, drafting agreements in 2 languages, mediating between cultures that approached business like different religions. When the deal closed, Jung had toasted her at the partnership dinner. To Naomi, he'd said, raising his glass. Proof that excellence transcends borders. 2 weeks later, everything burned. The competitor who'd lost the Hanmi bid filed a lawsuit claiming insider information. Emails appeared, forwarded from Naomi's account to an address she'd never seen, containing confidential bid strategies, internal valuations, privileged communications. This is impossible, she told Jung, her hands shaking as she stared at her computer screen. I never sent these. Someone hacked my account. Someone planted. The forensic analysis shows they originated from your workstation, Jung had said, his voice empty of the warmth she'd heard at that dinner. During hours when you were logged in, multiple witnesses saw you working late alone. The witnesses had been associates she'd mentored, paralegals she'd treated with respect. They testified that yes, she'd been stressed about the deal. Yes, she'd complained about the Korean partner's demands. Yes, they'd seen her on her laptop after everyone left, doors closed, looking nervous. Each statement another nail in her coffin, each face someone she'd trusted turning away. The Korean Bar Association's disciplinary hearing lasted 45 minutes. Her protests about fabricated evidence, about emails that couldn't be hers, about timestamps that proved she was in meetings when messages were sent, dismissed as technical arguments that missed the point. The point being that a foreign attorney had violated client confidentiality. The point being that Park and Associates, with their immaculate reputation, had cooperated fully with the investigation and terminated her immediately. The point being that she was an outsider who'd proven outsiders couldn't be trusted. License revoked. Visa status under review. Professional reputation destroyed so thoroughly that no firm would return her calls. And because she'd spent everything on Seoul's brutal cost of living, on the wardrobe necessary to look like she belonged in those conference rooms, on the apartment in the right neighborhood that screamed successful expatriate, she had nothing. Her mother's voice on the phone. Just come home, baby. We'll figure it out. But home meant Detroit, where her mother cleaned houses and her brother was barely staying ahead of his own bills. Home meant admitting she'd failed, meant being the cautionary tale, the smart girl who thought she could make it in a country that would never really accept her.
So she'd stayed.
Disappeared into the shadow economy of private events where English-speaking staff commanded slightly higher wages. Learned to stand invisible in rooms full of power while rich men discussed business over 50,001 bottles of wine. Became exactly what Seoul had always seen her as anyway, decorative, foreign, unthreatening. The help. She'd scrubbed toilets with a Harvard Law degree, smiled through jokes she didn't understand and propositions she pretended not to, watched contracts pass through wealthy hands and felt her legal training scream at obvious traps she wasn't allowed to mention because servers didn't read, didn't think, didn't exist beyond their ability to pour drinks without spilling. Until tonight. Until she'd seen her own destruction reflected in someone else's death warrant and couldn't stay silent anymore. Park and Associates didn't just fire me, Naomi said, looking at Jae-hyun across the contract that connected their fates. They erased me, made me a ghost. And that firm? She tapped the letterhead on his contract. Same attorneys, same structure, which means they're doing to you what they did to me. The only difference is, you're worth more dead than discredited. For 3 days, Naomi heard nothing. She worked her scheduled events, a corporate dinner in Apgujeong, a birthday party in Itaewon, and waited for consequences. Maybe Jae-hyun had decided she was more trouble than useful. Maybe Park and Associates would hear she'd surfaced and finish what they'd started. Maybe immigration would finally catch up with her precarious visa status. On the 4th day, Min-suk appeared at her apartment door. "Boss wants to see you," he said, his expression unreadable.
Now.
The drive back to the penthouse felt longer than it should have. Naomi sat in the back of the black sedan, watching Seoul blur past, wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. In this world, knowledge was currency, but it was also liability. She knew too much now about Jae-hyun's business, about the Japanese deal, about contracts that could destroy empires. People who knew too much had a habit of disappearing in the Han River. But when she entered the penthouse, Jae-hyun was alone, surrounded by documents spread across a conference table that hadn't been there during the dinner. He looked up, and she noticed the shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd slept about as much as she had. Park and Associates drafted 17 contracts for Korean organizations over the past 3 years, he said without preamble, gesturing to the papers. I had my people pull everything we could access. Legitimate businesses, criminal enterprises, political groups. Every single one contains variations of the trap you identified. Different mechanisms, same result. Asset transfer upon incapacitation. He picked up a file, dropped it back down. 3 of the targets are dead. 2 disappeared. For lost everything to bankruptcy or restructuring. And the Yamamoto Gumi expanded their Korean operations by 40% in the same time frame. Naomi moved closer to the table, her legal training pulling her toward the evidence, like gravity. They're not just corrupt lawyers. They're an assassination arm disguised as a law firm. Which brings us to you. Jae-hyun leaned against the table, arms crossed. I have a proposal. Work for me as legal counsel. Analyze every contract I touch, every agreement I sign, every deal I consider. Keep me alive with your expertise. In exchange, I provide protection, compensation, and the resources to rebuild your life. New identity, if you want it. Relocation to any country that will take you. A chance to start over somewhere Park and Associates can't reach. It was generous. More than generous. It was escape wrapped in a golden paracrase. And Naomi felt nothing but exhaustion at the thought of running again. Or, she asked, or what? You said proposal. That implies negotiation. What's my alternative? Jae-hyun's smile was sharp. The alternative is you walk away, and I ensure your safe passage anyway. You saved my life. I don't forget debts. But I'd prefer you stay. Naomi looked at the documents covering the table, evidence of systematic destruction, of lives erased with legal precision, of a conspiracy so elegant it had gone unnoticed until now. She thought about 18 months of invisibility, of legal expertise rotting and used, of watching the world from the margins while pretending she was content there. I'll stay, she said. But I'm not your employee. Employees follow orders. I need autonomy to do this right, to investigate, to question, to push back when something's wrong. I won't be decoration that happens to read contracts. If we do this, we're partners. Or it doesn't work. The silence stretched long enough for Naomi to wonder if she'd miscalculated. Then Jae-hyun extended his hand, the gesture oddly formal given the context. Partnership, he agreed. You keep me legally alive. I keep you physically alive. And we destroy the people who tried to erase both of us. His smile turned dangerous. That's exactly what I need. Naomi took his hand, feeling the calluses that came from violence and the controlled strength that came from power, and shook on an alliance that would either save them both or guarantee they went down together. One more thing, she said. I want Park and Associates to know I'm coming. Not now. Not yet. But eventually, I want them to understand exactly who exposed their operation. The ghost they created is going to bury them. Jae-hyun's laugh was low and genuinely pleased. I knew I liked you. The apartment was on the 38th floor of Jae-hyun's building, with views that made Naomi's old studio in Sindang look like a prison cell. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Namsan Tower, kitchen appliances she didn't know how to operate, a home office already equipped with 3 monitors, and a secure server connection. Min-suk had delivered her there with minimal conversation and a key card that accessed private elevators. Boss says you work from here now. Security's tighter. And you're close if he needs you. What he didn't say, and we can watch you. The war room, because that's what it became, was a converted conference space 2 floors down. Naomi walked in on her second morning to find 6 men watching her like she was an exotic animal that might bite. Jae-hyun's inner circle, finance, operations, enforcement, logistics. The ones who'd built an empire through violence and strategy, now expected to trust a Black American woman who'd been serving wine a week ago. "This is Naomi," Jae-hyun said from the head of the table, his tone making it clear this wasn't a discussion. "She's analyzing every contract we've signed in the past 5 years. Cooperate completely, or explain to me why you didn't." The finance director, 50-something, expensive watch, skeptical eyes, slid a folder across the table. "Partnership agreement with the Busan Shipping Consortium. Signed 8 months ago. Legal reviewed it thoroughly." Naomi opened the file, speed reading through dense Korean legalese while 6 men waited for her to fail. Article 4, Joint Profit Distribution. Article 8, Dispute Resolution. Article 12, Insurance Requirements. There, Section 12C, Liability Coverage with a specific valuation formula that used market conditions at time of assessment as the metric. "Who determines market conditions?" she asked. "The consortium," finance said. Standard practice. Standard practice is mutual determination or third-party assessment. This gives them unilateral control of valuations, which means they control your insurance payout if anything happens to your assets. Combined with the arbitration clause in Article 9 that triggers automatic receivership during disputes. She looked up. "You're one manufactured crisis away from losing the entire operation." The room went silent. Finance pulled the contract back, reading sections she'd identified, his face darkening. "Son of a, our legal team approved this." "Your legal team," Naomi said carefully, "is probably competent. But they're looking for standard risks. I'm looking for elegant traps designed by people who specialize in them." Over the next 3 weeks, she found 2 more contracts with similar structures. A real estate partnership that included a clause allowing temporary management transitions under vague circumstances. A joint venture with a Japanese logistics company that had the same Singapore arbitration trap as Jae-hyun's and signed contract. Each one a time bomb waiting for activation. The breakthrough came when Min Suk brought in a woman Naomi didn't recognize, late 50s, elegant black hanbok, eyes that had seen too much grief. "This is Lee Yun-hee," he said. Her husband was Oh Sung-jin. He ran the Myeongdong territory until 2 years ago. Naomi knew the name, one of the 3 dead men on Jae-hyun's list. "My husband was brilliant," Yun-hee said, her Korean formal and precise. "Careful. He reviewed every agreement personally. But 3 days before he died, he told me something I didn't understand until now." She met Naomi's eyes. He said, "The contract was perfect. Too perfect. Like someone designed it to look right while being completely wrong." The next day, his partners filed an arbitration claim. 2 days later, he was dead in a car accident that wasn't an accident. "What firm drafted the contract?" Naomi asked, though she already knew. "Park and Associates." The pattern was undeniable now. Park and Associates wasn't just collaborating with the Yamamoto Gumi, they were weaponizing law itself, turning contracts into assassination tools. Korean crime bosses eliminated, their territories absorbed, Japanese expansion disguised as legitimate business disputes. All of it legal. All of it lethal. Jae-hyun stood at the window, staring out at Seoul like he was seeing it differently now. "How many others?" he asked. "Based on their contract history?" Naomi pulled up her analysis on the main screen. "At least 8 more targets. Some already compromised, some in progress. We're looking at systematic elimination of Korean organized crime leadership to consolidate Yakuza control. And it's brilliant because no one's looking at law firms as weapons. Would you trust your life to a stranger's expertise, or would you stick with people who look like you but might be lying? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about when being different is actually your superpower." Naomi worked like a woman possessed. The war room became her territory. Whiteboards covered in flowcharts connecting Park and Associates to the Yamamoto Gumi, timelines tracking the systematic elimination of Korean bosses, legal structures mapped out in 3 languages. She slept 4 hours a night and dreamed in contract clauses. Min-suk started bringing her coffee at 2 a.m. without being asked, which she took as acceptance. Sort of. You're building a trap, Jae-hyun observed one night, studying the maze of shell companies she designed on the main screen. Not just defense. Offense. The best defense is turning their weapon back on them. Naomi pulled up another layer. Look, this is how Park and Associates structures their operations. They use Singapore entities to hide beneficial ownership. Communication flows through law firm privilege, which makes it investigation-proof. Everything appears legitimate because technically it is. Contract law, corporate formations, arbitration proceedings, all legal tools used legally. Just lethally. So we do the same thing. Better. She clicked through the structure she'd been building. We create a network of shell companies that mirror theirs. HK Holdings, registered in Hong Kong. Dayback Enterprises in Seoul. Pacific Bridge Capital in Singapore. Each one legitimate. Each one owned through layers that make beneficial ownership fuzzy. And each one wired with documentation protocols that automatically capture every communication, every transaction, every interaction with Park and Associates. Jae-hyun leaned closer, his eyes tracking the connections. They won't see it as suspicious. They'll see exactly what they expect to see, a Korean crime boss diversifying holdings through international corporate structures. It's what they advise their clients to do. The irony is beautiful. Naomi pulled up the revised contract. The poison clause stays in your agreement with the Yamamoto Gumi. Unchanged. Because now it's not a trap for you. It's bait for them. Explain. The arbitration clause triggers when they file a dispute, right? Asset freeze, receiver appointed, temporary incapacitation. But every one of your assets now flows through these shell companies. Which means when they try to freeze them, they'll need court orders across 3 jurisdictions. While they're filing those orders, our documentation protocol activates. She opened a secondary screen showing server architecture. Every email they send, every filing they make, every communication between Park and Associates and the Yamamoto Gumi gets captured and routed to encrypted servers. Not hacked, legally obtained through corporate discovery protocols we've embedded in the shell company structures. That's insane? Illegal? Neither, actually. It's aggressive corporate intelligence gathering using the same legal tools they weaponized against others. And here's the genius part. She pulled up the final layer. One of our shell companies is registered as a minority stakeholder in a Korean financial institution. Under Korean banking law, that gives us standing to request certain regulatory disclosures. The moment Park and Associates files their arbitration claim, we file a parallel regulatory complaint about suspicious international financial movements, which triggers mandatory investigations, which creates a paper trail they can't hide. Jae-hyun was quiet for a long moment, reading through the structure she'd built. It was like watching someone examine a weapon, testing its balance, appreciating its craftsmanship. How long until we're ready? 2 more weeks to finalize the corporate structures. Then we can sign your revised agreement with the Japanese. After that. Naomi felt something dark and satisfied settle in her chest. We wait for Park and Associates to activate their trap, and we watch it destroy them instead. You've thought of everything. I've thought of what they taught me. They wanted me to be exceptional at contract law, at finding loopholes, at building structures that looked legitimate while serving hidden purposes. I learned from the best. Now, I'm using those lessons to bury them. Jae-hyun studied her face, and for once his expression wasn't calculating or dangerous. It was something closer to respect. It's beautiful, he said quietly. You think like them, but better.
No, Naomi corrected.
I think like someone who knows exactly how they operate because they destroyed me with it. There's a difference.
They taught me the technique.
You gave me the reason to perfect it. Revenge.
Justice, she said.
With extremely elegant paperwork. The work consumed them, but somewhere between midnight strategy sessions and 3 a.m. coffee, the conversations shifted. It started innocuously. Naomi explaining American contract precedents, Jae-hyun clarifying Korean cultural context for business negotiations. But late nights had a way of stripping away professional distance, and exhaustion made people honest. My father ran this organization, Jae-hyun said one night, staring at the Seoul skyline rather than the contracts spread before them. He built it from street-level enforcement to something that controlled 3 districts. When he died, I was 24 and studying economics at Yonsei. I was supposed to be legitimate, the respectable son who managed the clean businesses while my uncle handled the rest. What changed? Naomi asked, closing her laptop to give him her attention. My uncle was ambitious. Saw my father's death as an opportunity to consolidate power. 2 weeks after the funeral, I learned he'd ordered the hit. Jae-hyun's voice was conversational, discussing murder like a business transaction. I had a choice, let him eliminate me too, or take control myself. So I did. Turns out I was better at this than economics. Do you regret it? Regret is expensive. Ideal in reality. He turned to look at her. The legitimate world and this one, they're not as different as people pretend. Both run on power, leverage, and the willingness to destroy competition. The only difference is how you file the paperwork and whether you admit what you're doing. Naomi thought about Park and Associates. Prestigious, legitimate, respected, and lethal. I spent years believing the legal profession was noble, that we were the guardians of justice, the architects of civilized society. She laughed, bitter. Then they framed me with legal tools and destroyed my life through proper channels. At least you're honest about what you are. That sounds like trauma talking. That sounds like clarity. She met his eyes. You know what's insane? I feel more respected working for a crime boss than I ever did at Seoul's most prestigious law firm. You actually listen when I speak. You value my expertise. You don't dismiss me because I'm a woman or foreign or inconvenient. Her voice dropped. They made me invisible. You made me essential. The irony is not lost on me. Jae-hyun was quiet for a moment. You realize that makes us both broken in complementary ways. Is that what we are? Broken? I order people killed, Naomi. You're helping me do it with legal precision. We're not exactly well-adjusted. Maybe not, she admitted. But I'm more myself now than I've been in 2 years. Even if myself is apparently someone who weaponizes contract law for a Korean crime syndicate. The laugh that escaped Jae-hyun was genuine, the sound transforming his face from dangerous to almost young. When you put it that way, we sound like a very specific kind of therapy group. Criminals Anonymous. Step 1. Admit you're good at things society doesn't approve of. They fell into comfortable silence, the kind that only developed between people who'd spent too many late nights in shared purpose. Naomi pulled the next contract toward her, and Jae-hyun reached for it at the same time. Their hands collided over Section 4, Paragraph 2. Both froze. It was absurd, touching hands like teenagers over a liability clause about shipping insurance. But the contact felt electric, charged with months of working in proximity, of trust built through shared danger, of late nights where partnership had started meaning something neither of them had defined. Jae-hyun pulled his hand back first, but his eyes held hers for a beat longer than necessary. We should focus.
Right.
Focus. Naomi forced her attention back to the document, hyper-aware of him sitting 6 inches away. Section 4 looks clean. No hidden receivers or arbitration traps. Just standard negligence provisions. Good. His voice was carefully neutral. That's good. Neither acknowledged what had just happened.
Neither needed to.
The tension in the room had shifted from professional to something else entirely, something that made Naomi's pulse quicken and her analytical mind shut down in favor of dangerous what-ifs. They worked until dawn, maintaining careful distance, speaking only about legal structures and corporate formations. But the awareness hummed between them like a live wire, the recognition that this partnership had become something more complex than business, more dangerous than crime, more inevitable than either of them wanted to admit. At 6 a.m., when Naomi finally closed her laptop and stood to leave, Jae-hyun caught her wrist. Not grabbing, just touching. The contact deliberate but gentle. "Thank you," he said. "For staying. For fighting. For being exactly who you are." Naomi looked at his hand on her wrist, then at his face, at the man who'd given her back her voice when the world had stolen it. "We're going to destroy them," she said. "All of them." "I know." His thumb traced once across her pulse point before he let go. "That's what makes this so dangerous." She wasn't sure if he meant the plan or whatever was growing between them. Probably both. The Shilla Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a theater of legitimacy. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables draped in white silk, where Korea's most dangerous men sat alongside Japanese partners in suits worth more than cars. Waiters circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than Naomi used to make in a week. The irony of her standing here in Tom Ford instead of a server's uniform wasn't lost on her. Park and Associates had sent 3 senior partners, Jung himself, plus 2 others who'd built careers on destruction disguised as legal service. They stood near the signing table like priests at an altar, briefcases full of documents that would transfer power under the guise of partnership. Jae-hyun caught Naomi's eye across the room and smiled, the dangerous kind that promised violence wrapped in civility. She nodded once. "It's time." The signing ceremony was elaborate. Speeches in Korean and Japanese about mutual prosperity, strategic alliance, the future of Asian business cooperation. Every word a lie, every gesture rehearsed. When Jae-hyun finally sat at the table, fountain pen in hand, cameras flashed. This moment would be documented. After all, the day Korean organized crime leadership voluntarily signed itself into extinction. He signed with theatrical flourish, each stroke of his name a performance. The Japanese delegation smiled. Park and Associates senior partners exchanged satisfied glances. They'd won. Or so they thought. 4 hours later, Naomi sat in Jae-hyun's penthouse war room, watching multiple screens display the countertrap spring in real time. Her laptop showed Park and Associates servers. They'd activated the arbitration clause exactly as predicted, filing claims in Singapore that would trigger asset freezes, receiver appointments, the systematic dismantling of Jae-hyun's organization. Except every filing triggered Naomi's documentation protocols. Every communication between Park and Associates and the Yamamoto Gumi flooded into encrypted servers that automatically forwarded to prosecutors who'd been quietly briefed over the past 2 weeks. Every shell company interface they tried to access captured additional evidence of conspiracy, racketeering, and systematic murder disguised as legal practice. Screen 2 showed Korean prosecutors raiding the Shilla, where the celebration had turned into chaos. Park and Associates senior partners were being escorted out in handcuffs, Jung's face pale with the realization that everything had been reversed. The trap they'd built had caught them instead. Screen 3 displayed Japanese law enforcement databases updating in real time. The Yamamoto Gumi's corporate structures, their shell companies, their connections to Korean operations, all of it exposed simultaneously across 3 jurisdictions. The evidence was overwhelming, beautifully documented, legally obtained through the corporate discovery protocols Naomi had embedded in every structure. Screen 4 showed news broadcasts. A junior attorney from Park and Associates, the one who'd approached Naomi weeks ago, guilt-ridden about his role in her destruction, was testifying live about the firm's conspiracy. His voice shook, but his facts were precise, connecting years of systematic assassination to the lawyers who'd made it possible. "They're trying to run Min-suk reported from his position monitoring airport security. 3 Yamamoto Gumi executives, private jet at Incheon. Not anymore, Jae-hyun said calmly, watching the screen shift to show Korean customs agents boarding the aircraft. Interpol red notices went out 20 minutes ago. They're not going anywhere. Naomi felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. The satisfaction of watching corrupt power collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Park and Associates had built their empire on invisible violence. She destroyed them with visible evidence, every piece of it legal, documented, irrefutable. You just destroyed the most powerful law firm in Seoul, Jae-hyun said, turning to look at her. How do you feel? Naomi thought about the version of herself who'd scrubbed toilets and stayed silent, who'd made herself invisible to survive. She thought about Yun-hee's husband saying the contract was too perfect. She thought about every person Park and Associates had erased. Visible, she said and smiled. I feel visible. On the screens, the news anchors were calling it the biggest corruption scandal in Korean legal history. Prosecutors were promising more arrests. The Korean Bar Association was launching emergency investigations. And somewhere in a holding cell, senior partner Jung was realizing that the woman he destroyed had been the architect of his downfall. Jae-hyun's hand found hers. They'll come for us eventually. The authorities. I cooperated, but I'm not clean. I know. And you're staying anyway? Naomi squeezed his hand, watching Seoul's legal establishment burn on screen. I didn't spend 6 weeks building this trap just to miss the after-party. Besides, she turned to him, someone has to make sure your immunity deal holds up. Turns out you need a really good lawyer. His laugh was low and genuine. Best investment I ever made. No, Naomi Gerekti. Best partnership. There's a difference. 1 year later, Naomi stood before the Korean Bar Association in a conference room that had once witnessed her destruction. The faces were different. The old guard had resigned in disgrace or been disbarred themselves, but the mahogany table was the same, the formal procedures identical. Except this time, she wasn't defending herself. She was being honored. Ms. Washington, the new bar president said in English, though Naomi could have understood the Korean just fine, your work exposing systematic corruption within our legal community has prompted the most significant ethics reform in this organization's history. The legal strategy you employed, what some academics are calling ethical jujitsu, is now being studied at Seoul National University, Korea University, and Yonsei as a case study in using legal structures to expose illegality. The commendation was formal, complete with a certificate she'd probably frame out of spite. But the real vindication came afterward, in the hallway, when 3 of the associates who testified against her approached with apologies she didn't entirely forgive, but accepted anyway. Survival meant knowing when to let go. The job offers had started within weeks of Park and Associates' collapse. International firms wanted the lawyer who'd single-handedly dismantled Seoul's most prestigious corrupt practice. Publishers wanted book deals. Universities wanted guest lectures. Harvard had sent a particularly enthusiastic email about her innovative approach to corporate investigation. But standing in that hallway, Naomi realized she wasn't interested in any of them. She'd been exceptional in their world, and they destroyed her for it. Now she was exceptional in a world she'd helped build, and that made all the difference. The celebration dinner was at the same restaurant where Jae-hyun had first proposed their partnership. Different context, same view of Seoul's lights reflecting off the Han River. His organization had transformed over the year, legitimate businesses replacing criminal operations, strategic consulting instead of territorial control. The transition wasn't complete, probably never would be entirely, but Jae-hyun had proven surprisingly talented at legal empire building when guided by someone who knew the loopholes. So, he said, pouring wine that probably cost more than her first month's rent used to, Harvard wants you back. London wants you. Even Singapore sent an offer. I saw the email from that financial firm. Partners track, immediate start. You've been reading my email? Min-suk has been reading your email. I just get the summaries. His smile was unapologetic. You're considering them. I was. Past tense. Naomi took the wine, savoring the first sip. Turns out I'm not interested in being exceptional for people who'll destroy me the moment I become inconvenient. Once was enough. Jae-hyun pulled an envelope from his jacket, sliding it across the table with the same deliberate motion he'd used to slide that poison contract toward her a year ago. Except this one was different. She could tell by the way he watched her face. Inside were partnership documents, actual equity papers, not employment contracts. 50-50 ownership of KBH Holdings, the legitimate parent company of his restructured empire. Her name listed as co-founder, equal authority, equal control. I don't want you to work for me, Jae-hyun said quietly. I want to build with you. As equals. In every way. The words hung in the air, weighted with more than business implications. Naomi looked at the papers, then at him. At the man who'd given her back her voice when she'd forgotten she had won. Professionally and personally? She asked, needing to hear him say it. Professionally and personally. Partnership means partnership, Naomi.
You taught me that.
He leaned forward. I know what I am. What we are. This world won't ever be completely clean. But with you, it's honest.
Real.
And I'd rather build something real with you than build anything else with anyone else. Naomi thought about the version of herself who'd cleaned wealthy people's studies and stayed silent. Who'd made herself invisible because being seen had meant being destroyed. She thought about Yunhee's husband and the others Park and associates had erased. She thought about the junior attorney's testimony and Jung's handcuffs and the satisfied weight of watching corrupt power collapse. Then she thought about late nights building traps with the only person who'd ever seen her as essential rather than convenient. Yes, she said. To all of it. They toasted with wine that tasted like victory and partnership and the kind of future you built by refusing to apologize for occupying space. As their glasses touched, Naomi caught her reflection in the restaurant window, no longer invisible, no longer small, no longer diminished by a world that hadn't known what to do with her excellence. Just Naomi. Finally, completely, powerfully herself. And that was more than enough. If you enjoyed Naomi's journey from invisible to unstoppable, please like this story and subscribe for more tales about people who refuse to stay erased. Your support helps us create stories where expertise, courage, and refusing to be small become actual superpowers. What would you do if you had to choose between safety somewhere new or justice where you were destroyed? Share your thoughts in the comments.